Hello, welcome to the New Stack Makers, a podcast where we talk about at-scale application development, deployment, and management. Red Hat OpenShift is the sponsor of the New Stacks podcast from KubeCon plus Cloud Native Con 2018. Red Hat is a big player in the Kubernetes community. They were one of the first to be really behind Kubernetes. OpenShift has had tremendous success. We really want to thank them for participating with us here at KubeCon plus Cloud Native Con in Copenhagen. Learn more about Red Hat OpenShift at openshift.com. That's openshift.com. Michael Hausenblas, developer evangelist, developer advocate of the OpenShift team. Red Hat, how are you?
Well, thank you very much, Alex. I'm really good. I'm excited to be here in Copenhagen at the KubeCon. Beautiful weather, and looking forward.
What is serverless anyway? Isn't it just a resource that we're programming?
So I was told that there are still somewhere servers, so it's probably more about what eventually the developer gets to see and has to deal with, right?
But it's an abstracted concept. It's not necessarily serverless. It's an abstracted concept, so we're making it like the server as the lesser value than the resource itself, and because the server comprises the resource.
Right. So I initially wasn't a huge fan, and I blogged about the term serverless, because it's to me a bit like NoSQL. It wasn't really about SQL or whatever. It was about the inherent capabilities of RDBMS to be able to shard their data. And to me, serverless is like, I still prefer the term functions.
I know you do. I saw that.
But I'm kind of like, now the new way to deal with it seems to be serverless being this umbrella term for everything, where you have a nicer interface where you don't have to provision servers as such. And I'm cool with that. So I'm using serverless and functions as a service kind of interchangeably now. That's fine.
Huh. So what's the difference between the serverless point of view that you see from different providers, really? I mean, there's Lambda is called serverless.
Yeah.
How do you distinguish that from other functions as a service that you see from OpenFaaS or where they're using containers in a context to create a serverless kind of environment? Right.
So you did a great survey there, essentially showing that I think over 60-70% of folks out there who are buying into that new paradigm are using it on AWS with Lambda. And AWS has done such a big investment, starting in 2014 or 15, and they did this deep integration with, on the one hand, the triggers that allow you to trigger a certain function, and then the integrations, because the functions, they are stateless, so you need to keep the state somewhere.
Right.
Having these deep integrations is really useful, and that is something that sets Lambda really apart to everything else we see out there. The question then is really, if you don't want to have this, lock into a certain platform, if you want to run it on your own somewhere, what are your options? I talked about that in Lightning Talk on Tuesday, and there are plenty of these things available on Kubernetes, OpenWhisk being one of them. And there you still have a little bit work to do, right? You need to make sure that the integrations are there. In AWS environment, you have S3 and SNS and whatever there and integrated. So it is certainly a great tool in the toolbox, but to me it's not like a silver bullet in the sense of that any kind of workload is a perfect match for that. And the other aspect just worth mentioning in that context, because you mentioned containers as well, I see containers more and more, and I agree also with Simon Wardley there, that containers will probably fade back into the background more and more as we advance in that space, and developers will more and more have these kind of functions as service interfaces. They will just provide the code, as we have been doing it with passes and Heroku and stuff like that for a couple of years now.
Right.
It's not that.
But with so one of the things that trying to get figured out is, how will tool chains be affected? How will developer tool chains be affected by these new environments?
Right. So on the upside, I see a lot of positive developments that it's pretty easy to actually write something. Kelsey mentioned yesterday, jokingly, I suppose, as long as it's written in Node.js, right? This whole, you can write it in any language as long as it's written in Node.js. But like from a developer point of view, I don't think that this is the big problem. It's more on the operational point of side. So if you actually think about who is gonna be on call when you're operating that at scale, since you don't necessarily have any administrators around anymore, at some point in time you have to come up with a strategy there. And some folks are comfortable with that. They say, yep, we put our developers on call, and others probably not, have not yet figured out how to go about that. And in addition to that, there is also the orchestration layer, to me at least, kind of like not existing there yet. If you have more than a handful of functions, how do you actually orchestrate these functions? That's kind of like an open issue. I mean, IBM has something there, open source piece out there, but it's not yet widely sold.
How would you orchestrate? That's such a difficult thing to figure out. How would you orchestrate functions?
Right.
Would you have to almost preserve the state?
Given that these functions are supposed to be stateless, it's not so much about the state, but it's about having dependencies.
But can you take a snapshot?
I know the issues. I have not yet, besides the IBM stuff, I haven't really dug into the solutions really. Right? What would be good ways to go about that? I think the community needs to. We need to see more like large scale deployments, and by large scale I really mean numbers of functions. Like if you have a monolith, breaking it down to 200, 300 functions, how do we deal with that, right? And I would expect that, as with anything else, people initially would do some homegrown stuff. They would have, I don't know, shell scripts or Terraform or whatever that does that kind of orchestration. And at some point in time, there will probably be a CNCF project that emerges as the standard for function orchestration.
Well, we now have there is now a serverless worker working group inside CNCF. Are you part of that?
Right. Yeah. So I'm trying to contribute from the angle of being a representative of a user. So we do have a skin in the game with OpenWhisk, but I'm not part of the product team there. I'm really trying to be as a kind of an advocate for the users. What, from a usability UX point of view, what would you expect there? So I love all of the frameworks equally. I respect all of the engineering power that goes in there, but I really want to make sure that the end users, which are developers in that case, are well represented and have a say there how a solution might look like.
I'm looking at this older. I'm not sure how old this diagram is.
In the upper left corner, it should say the date.
Is that it? I can't.
That is actually the most recent one. Yeah.
Yeah. And you did you work on this?
No, I just I didn't input to it. I just reviewed it and had a look at what is there. There are ongoing discussions also on Slack about how to structure things here. It's still early days, and it's great to see so many vendors jumping on that.
Right.
But to me, that is also a little bit that's part of the problem. That maybe it's a little bit too early for certain vendors to push certain solutions or certain views on it. The cloud event stuff is certainly something very positive to mention there to make things interoperable between different providers. But it's still I would like to see a little bit more, not standardization, but more like good practices being documented and shared between users and developers.
So the good practices being documented and shared. So. What are you looking for? What would be helpful to people? I mean, in terms of those processes, what process have you seen that have worked well?
So what I would love to see is, let's say next year, either here or somewhere else in one of the many CNCF events, that a keynote by someone that delivers the same that Sarah did today from New York Times around their experiences in terms of migrating a monolith or container-based solution to function as a service, saying here are the steps that we did. This is how we manage the transition. These are the insights insights here in terms of operational issues, in terms of, we have been developing functions in 3 different languages. Here is how we, are doing a deployment. Here is how we doing upgrades. Here is how we doing the monitoring bits and so on. So this kind of like sharing how the transition and the lessons learned were essentially. That's what I'm looking for.
Part of the way the serverless landscape is divided according to the CNCF is by tools, security, framework, platform. The tools, we see companies like IOPipe, a name we know, Stackery, even Iron.io, which I think is an older, which is now part of Oracle.
Yeah.
On the security side, companies like SNCC. In the framework side, you have a lot of new types of a lot of new things out here, like Flogo, and I think that layer I'm pretty interested in, like a serverless framework. How would you kind of think about a serverless framework?
I like the idea of a framework here. I'm still a little undecided if that is the ultimate way to go about that. I see the pros and the cons, and I wish there would be a kind of interoperability layer there to make sure that, again, not only on the development end of things, but really on the operational kind of things, you would be able to write, a function defining the triggers and the integrations with whatever state outside of the function in one, let's say, AWS Lambda, and then being able to move that to OpenWhisk, for example. And as I said, with cloud events, we have at least one part standardized, but it's still a lot of manual work to make these integrations that actually tell you, okay, I'm going to put the results into some object store, or I'm going to read something from a relational database or whatever. Making that interoperable. If a standard might be nice, but at least interoperability, that would be, I think, a really first.
Interoperability would be critical.
Yes. Between the different solutions, you have the 3 big cloud providers there, AWS Lambda, you have Microsoft functions and the Google functions, or Azure functions and Google functions, and being able to, in the same way that nowadays, I can build a container image on my laptop here, and then I can run it on Google Container Engine, I can run it on OpenShift, I can run it everywhere. Whoever understands this kind of standard of a container image, and I like to have the same interoperability here for a function. And that is, as I said, it's not just about the code, it's really about these integrations and the triggers that needs to be kind of like portable between the different providers there, so that you really have, you can start, for example, on premises in OpenWhisk, and then you have the possibility to move your stuff to Lambda and the other way around as well. That would be my vision there.
So how do you distinguish between all these different these different offers that you see out there? I mean, in the frameworks alone, we have Apex, .arc, AWS, SAM, Flogo. I mean, the list goes on. How do you distinguish between them?
Distinguish in
how are you trying to? I mean, if you look at across all, if you look across serverless tools in different, in different categories, such as frameworks, I think this is kind of where the complexity starts to lie within. What do you want to? What are you trying to do, and what are you trying to achieve?
Right.
Are serverless technologies becoming, to a certain degree, semantic, where you want to be building your patterns, and I mean, are there some base functionality, and like, for example, these frameworks that you should always be looking for? It seems to be getting to this point where we're reaching this kind of like chaos point, because there is this emerging froth for sure.
Right. Yeah, I agree. It's a bit like with passes, that they are opinionated, and with that, it's great on the one hand in terms of productivity, but to me it's always this trade-off between convenience and productivity on the one hand, on the other hand, lockdown, and you might not have the full control over what you want to do. Like, you have certain limits in there, and they might be reasonable. Like, I think it's still, 300 seconds milliseconds or whatever for function execution in Lambda, and you can negotiate with AWS if you have good context to say, I need more than that. But still, that is a limitation that it might not be possible for you to use that. And if you want to have that control, well, then you end up deploying your own framework or whatever on top of Kubernetes, for example. And at the end of the day, I think an organization needs to find that, where in that spectrum do you see yourself? Are you fine with being a bit more confined, but having the convenience around that everything is sorted for you, or are you need more control, or think you need more control, and that's why you need to, roll your own stuff essentially.
So what's the Red Hat point of view then in terms of serverless and Kubernetes?
Right. So we initially had a project called Fabricate that was our attempt to deal with that, and when then later on IBM essentially brought OpenWhisk into the game and donated it to Apache Software Foundation, our engineering muscles essentially are nowadays behind OpenWhisk from the product perspective, so making that run great on OpenShift, but we don't prescribe people. We don't say this is the only way that you can run serverless on OpenShift. We enable customers to pick whatever they like. So we have customers using Hausenblas, for example, there, and we just want to make sure that all of that runs really great on OpenShift. So we are kind of like neutral in that sense, other than that we have the investment in OpenWhisk from our engineering perspective, if that makes sense.
So the people who you respect in the, technology peers, when you talk about this topic, what are the questions you're asking them? What are you trying to learn from them about these serverless technology? What are they trying to learn from you?
So I'm mainly interested in it's what I've been doing the last couple of years already in these operational aspects, because I haven't yet quite figured out what the best practice they are. When I talk with different people, I get different answers there. As I said, some of them are cool with having their developers on call, taking care of that. Others say, well, it's not really different to what we have already with Kubernetes. Developers have a certain responsibility, need to be concerned with things like monitoring, application level monitoring and logging and so on, and tracing. So it's not that big of a difference. I do believe that serverless really requires you to think about who is wearing a pager at the end of the day. And if you're in an extreme case like AWS Lambda, where you certainly don't have access to the administrators there unless you know someone at AWS, then someone needs to react. If a function is not working properly, if there is some issue that is not taken care of directly by the environment, then who will be the person who is wearing the pager and looking into that, right? This is certainly something where I'm still asking people for their opinion and trying to get best practices out of that. I had an interesting discussion with Kelsey yesterday around that topic as well. He talked about that in his evening keynote around the cloud event stuff, essentially being able to trigger functions across different providers. And that is something I'm also very interested in digging deeper into that to see how to make that work nicely on Kubernetes as well. Yeah.
So in terms of your own research into those best practices, what are some of the best practices that you're finding? Are there some best practices that look promising for you?
Right. So to me, it seems that a lot of companies that report success stories at their various serverless conferences nowadays already seem to have successes in like very confined spaces. Like they have a couple of functions doing replacing typically things like a cron job, or we're gonna create an image preview of something. So a handful typically using the same programming language, and I think that might actually be a really good approach there, to start small, in a not necessarily breaking up your monolith into 200 functions, but really with small things. Call it glue code, call it whatever. And I like to suggest this phrase that maybe serverless, at least for now, is kind of like this visual basic of application for cloud native computing, right?
Yeah.
And given that it's always based on certain events happening, it's kind of a nice way to think about it. This glue code of, you have things that you might have a backend in S3, you might have some machine learning API that does some face recognition or whatever, and you have some functions as a service that it acts a bit like a glue code that calls into different other things and stores it then again in other backends. And maybe that's a good pattern to start with, and then as we gather more experience in many functions working together, I would assume that some best practices emerge around that as well, how to manage that.
I was thinking about this this presentation that we did, and I just was looking at it. And one of the discussions is about where we're starting to see the intersections with serverless, and it seems like I was talking with Nick Rockwell of the New York Times in a podcast, and he basically calls serverless in some respects, just a reminder that serverless was also a CDN back in the day, right? And then they've been around a long time. But what are some of the domains where where do you really see that intersection clearly between serverless and, for example, IT?
Serverless and IT in the sense of IT.
IT domains. So, for example, like when you're thinking about, I guess there's a lot of ways to think about that. I think one of the things is, like, if you think about serverless and, like, for example, we're seeing the future of IT emerge into more, to be more DevOps oriented, right? Where it's more open source focused, right? Right. How does serverless kind of play in? Does serverless tell an open source story? Are there, the solutions because we're seeing Lambda, right? We're seeing which is not open source whatsoever. And the cloud services are all building their own proprietary.
Got it. Yeah.
Serverless environments.
Yeah. That's actually a very interesting question, and so far the only thing you can say for sure is that the absolute, like the 500-pound gorilla in that space absolutely is AWS Lambda, and it would be an interesting move by them to open source that. They could have, I think, a similar success that what Google had with Kubernetes in that space.
Yeah.
Would be an interesting move. I don't expect that to happen, but that would certainly change things a lot.
Yeah.
I still see that in this open source domain, I had, I think, like 10 or 11 different projects on top of Kubernetes there. Most of them, like 60-70%, started in 2017, so pretty young. But pretty much all of them having like heavyweights backing them, right? It's like really, like pretty much everyone who is relevant in that space is backing at least one project there. So it's going to be interesting to see, and I also expect some consolidation in the next year or two. You might end up with 2 or 3, dominating ones. I don't expect that one of them will dominate, but yeah, let's see what AWS. So AWS, if you're listening, go into open source Lambda.
Let's see it, open source Lambda. So yeah, there are actually several projects out there. There's Whisk, Apache OpenWhisk. There's Iron Functions, which was originally Iron.io, right? Now under Oracle. Kubeless, Fission, Serverless Framework. Azure Function.
There's OpenFaaS.
Yeah, OpenFaaS.
Yeah.
There's lots of them out there.
There are lots of them, yeah.
Well, good. Well, so over the next 6 months, we're leading up to the next KubeCon event.
Right.
I don't see things slowing down.
Not at all. And these are just like the core bits, right? And you see vendors jumping on that left and right, be it, security, be it monitoring.
Yeah.
And as I said, to me, the biggest area that is still kind of like almost empty other than the IBM stuff, I haven't really seen anything there, is the orchestration bits. It might still be too early to really say what's a good approach there, but I would also expect that, a few more companies do something around that. Maybe even including Red Hat. I'm not sure. We haven't revealed any plans yet.
Michael, thank you so much for chatting with me. I really appreciate it.
Cheers.
Cheers. Red Hat OpenShift is the sponsor of the New Stacks podcast from KubeCon plus Cloud Native Con. Red Hat has been on a tear with its acquisition of CoreOS. OpenShift platform just seems to accelerate. Big supporters of the Kubernetes community. You can learn more about Red Hat OpenShift at openshift.com. Listen to more episodes of the New Stack Makers at thenewstack.io/podcast. Please rate and review us on iTunes, like us on YouTube, and follow us on SoundCloud. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.